I'm agreeing with you, John. Okay. Yesterday we started talking about innate behaviors. Remember, innate behaviors are ones that are inherited. They have a genetic basis. They're things that animals do that are not learned. All right, let's focus here. But we want to compare instinct to reflexes. So yesterday we talked about reflexes. We said that they're fairly short and simple. And so it stands to reason that instinct, on the other hand, is going to be complex. It generally is going to involve several parts. And when we say several parts, I know it's a little vague, but it could be several parts as far as the behavior, or several parts as far as the stimulus that causes the behavior. So, for example, migrating birds, they're going to be stimulated by both temperature, but also the how slanted the sun's rays are. They can actually see polarized light, so they can see what the angle of the sun's rays are. There's a few different stimuli that actually go into that instinct. Okay, and overall, instincts tend to be more long-term than a reflex. So a reflex is something that takes place in a few seconds at most, even if it's a hormonal reflex like the fight or flight response. Whereas an instinct is something that can take as much as a couple of minutes or even weeks. So the whole migration thing is going to take weeks, even up to on the order of months, depending on the type of organism. Yes, that would be an instinctive behavior. Now, there's some reasons for that. We can come up with reasons why that would be advantageous, but it is a genetic thing. So geese, right, that didn't fly in that V formation would get more tired out because of the way aerodynamics works and would be less likely to survive and reproduce. And so the ones that did fly in a V, those genes were selected for in the next generation. So it would look cooler. But there are some real advantages to aerodynamics as far as not getting as tired. So basically geese draft each other just like NASCAR. And different geese will take their turns in the front doing the majority of the work. Okay, so instincts tend to be a lot more long-term overall. We're going to talk about a few different types of instincts here. And one major instinct is courtship behavior. Now, we have talked about courtship behavior before, because remember, this goes along with sexual selection. So remember when we talked about sexual selection, we talked about how there were a few different ways that animals would try to gain mates, right? So appearance. There's a few different ways of appearance. What's that? Sparring, so males fighting for access to females. Okay. All those different things go into courtship behaviors. Now again, those courtship behaviors are not learned. They're innate behaviors. And so the peacock, does the peacock really know that it has this big fanciful tail? Not really. It's just instinct for him when he's around females in the breeding season to fan that out and try to show himself off. Here's a frigate bird. They've got this kind of skin pouch on their neck that they can inflate like a balloon. Yeah, kind of. Well, I mean, what's interesting is if you saw this bird without it, you would not even know that they have any red on them at all. It's just when they blow it up that you actually see it. So they're able to hide it fairly well. Okay, blackbirds. If you see blackbirds in the springtime, red-winged blackbirds, right, they'll sit on top of something, they'll call, and they'll kind of fluff their wings and show off that red patch. They can hide the red patch too, though. Okay. So courtship behaviors are behaviors that species carry out just before mating. Okay, now when we talked about sexual selection, we kind of focused on all the male behaviors that try to attract mates, but females have courtship behaviors too. There will be certain ways that different animals will, or female animals will let the males know that they are in the mood for mating. So they'll show that they are ready to be mated with. And a lot of times these courtship behaviors will help species recognize each other. Okay, so there are certain types of organisms that are very similar to other types of organisms, but they have slightly different mating behaviors and courtship behaviors so that they're able to kind of communicate, hey, I'm of the same species as you, we should mate. One of the examples that, if you remember, we talked about, there's certain different bird species that look very similar that have different calls. That's not distracting at all. So, for a good example, our oh my. There are eastern and western meadowlarks. The ones that we get around here tend to be the western kind, but there's definitely places where those two groups overlap. They look exactly the same. There's no way you can really tell the difference just by looking at them, but they have very different songs. And so, especially where they overlap, that's a way for males to say, hey, I'm a western meadowlark. You should mate with me, other western meadowlark females. Okay, another good example is fireflies. So fireflies, when they light up their rear ends, their abdomens, they're advertising for mates. But there's different firefly species, and they will blink differently. So the patterns that they blink will indicate, hey, I'm this type of species, or I'm this other type of species. Another interesting case is where you have species that have a nuptial gift. And I think the most interesting case of this is actually in spiders. Because in a lot of cases, in most cases actually, female spiders are bigger than male spiders and will eat them if they come along. So how does mating work if the female is hungry? Well, a male will actually catch a fly or some other thing, wrap it up, and present it as a gift. And then as the female is eating that kind of takes her attention off of possibly eating the male, and then the mating can happen. Although sometimes right after mating, then the female still eats the male. And that's fairly common in certain spider populations. Okay, and that there's no sexual pressure against that because the mating has already been completed. Whatever happens after the mating doesn't matter, and so it doesn't really affect the likelihood of having offspring if you eat your mate after mating happens. Not usually. Like they may eat babies of other spiders, but they're not going to eat their own. I mean that'd be a bad selection pressure because then there would be no genes to be passed on to the next generation if that behavior came about. Okay, let's also talk about territories. So territoriality reduces competition. That sounds actually a little paradoxical because it seems like territoriality, where males are fighting or whatever, actually would increase competition. But the whole point is, if a species is evolved so that they kind of have a certain territory that they're in charge of, that means that they get all the resources in that, and you're not going to have direct competition for food or mates or anything like that. Well, and those are interesting cases, but it turns out that it's very uncommon, or I shouldn't say very uncommon. It's fairly rare for organisms to actually fight. So we're going to talk about that when we talk about aggressive behaviors. Most things are basically bluffs, and whoever flinches first loses and runs away. Even really in like the stags and the deer sparring, they're not really looking to try to hurt each other, because the more you try to hurt somebody, the more likely you are to get hurt too. And so a lot of it just comes down to who's going to back down first. We'll kind of be talking about that on the way. No, there are no natural primate populations in the U.S., in North America. So, when we talk about competition here, we're talking about a competition for food. And that tends to be one of the big ones. You're going to have a territory of, whatever food sources are there. It's going to encompass that. Potential mates. And also habitat, which kind of feeds into that, but we're talking about being able to, I'm thinking mostly in like fish populations where you have territoriality for like cave spaces where you can hide out and make a home and a nest. So there's a few different ways that animals are going to kind of indicate where their territory is. Some of it is with direct fighting. Or sparring. So if you're an organism that holds a certain territory, you're an animal and another animal comes in, you'll try to drive them off. Like we'll talk about when we talk about aggression in the next section. Again, most of those are going to be just kind of power plays. They're not true fights. Calling. Okay, birds obviously are a big example of this. The biggest reason that they sing is to kind of indicate, hey, this is my territory, and if you actually watch a bird, he'll fly around from tree to tree in his area and say, this is my tree, this is my tree, this is my tree. And other birds, if they come up and challenge him, then they'll be driven away. So it depends on the because different birds have different social groups, right? Like blackbirds, the males have solitary territories, so they're not going to flock together, really. Now, grackles flock, but those are a different type of bird. But they tend to not flock in the breeding times. So in breeding times, they'll separate from themselves. So, right, robins, I think, tend to have their own separate territory. Yeah, a lot of pair-bonded birds. There are some birds that live in like rookeries and things like that. Great blue herons is a good example. They'll build a whole rookery, and a bunch of them will live together, but it just kind of depends. And sometimes we have chemical indicators. Which we call pheromones. Actually, I think there's another E there. Now, pheromones are certain chemicals that are excreted by the organism that can be used in communication. And when we talk about communication, we'll talk more about pheromones. In a lot of cases, those pheromones are produced in the urine of the animal. So we think about wolves marking their territory. So this wolf right here is basically saying, this is part of my territory, and another wolf that comes along that smells that should know that it's not going to come into that area, otherwise it'll be looking for a fight.
How come dogs just like pee on the thing?
Yeah, same thing.
I mean, like, when they walk by it, they just pee on it too. They don't, like, run away.
So, okay, what a lot of times will happen, and the part of the problem is dogs have been domesticated, and we've bred them for certain things, so some of their innate and instinctive behaviors have been kind of, watered down. Yes, chemical indicators. But usually what will happen is you'll have two areas, right, of two territories that butt up against each other. So this wolf will come up and it'll pee right here to say, this is my territory. And another wolf from the neighboring territory will come up and he'll add his right there. And they kind of both know, okay, this is a common boundary. It's almost like an invisible fence. And they agree, yes, this tree right here represents a boundary between our territories, and that's fine. And organisms, males, as long as they stay in those territories, there's usually not any kind of conflict. So that's why a lot of times you'll see where one organism will urinate, another one will come up and mark the same spot. But it's not saying that he's trying to encroach. They're agreeing on a shared border there. Okay. So territoriality leads to efficient use of resources, because that wolf in that area is going to catch prey and things in that area, and it's going to use it's going to use the resources in that area, and the territoriality kind of splits it up so that each wolf has its own resources. So there's efficient use of resources, and that actually leads to increased survivability of young. Oops. Survivorship. Okay, so there is an evolutionary advantage. There's a natural selection pressure here for these territories to form, because you get more young that are going to carry those genes on because of that efficient use of resources. And it also actually reduces fighting. So by organisms agreeing that they have their own separate territories, you don't get near as much fighting as if they were just all kind of mixed in and actually trying to go for the same resources.